We're going to start off today, and this presentation is, as we see right here, Fine Art Long Exposure, Black and White Photography. This is something that I've recently got addicted to doing. Really love it. And so we're going to go through this presentation just so we can talk about it real quickly. We'll talk about some images, then we'll talk about some techniques that we use for actually going out and shooting, and then finally we're going to go through and edit some images inside of Lightroom with Silverfx Pro 2, just to give you all an idea about how this stuff works. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask the questions. We've got some folks standing by that can help answer those questions, and we'll be able to answer some questions later on as well, depending on how much time goes by. So that being said, we'll start off. So black and white photography to me is one of my favorite types of photography. It's something that I've really loved for a very long time. And recently I got into the whole long exposure world just because I was looking for something a little bit different, a little bit new. I really, really love the look of the long exposure. I started off just doing water, but then I started realizing that what I'm really addicted to is clouds, and that's why this whole webinar is called Chasing Clouds. My wife calls me the cloud chaser. Whenever we're driving anywhere, all I do is look at where clouds are, what the direction of the clouds are, and if there's any interesting subject matter, and then jump out of the car and set up my camera to take some pictures. One of the things that's really fun about long exposure work, though, is that it helps us create a different look or a different mood in the photography. One of the things that I always believed about photography and what we do as photographers is show the world to our friends and family in a way that maybe they're not seeing it. And that's really to say that we want to be able to take something that's around us, that we all could see if we just stopped, slowed down, and looked at it, but then also trying to find a different twist on it, either a different perspective, a different vantage point, or being able to take advantage of some of the unique elements of photography, like the ability to control the appearance of time through our shutter speed. And so it's really, really neat to be able to use all of this kind of functionality that we have and our ability to look at the world and to really slow things down as we're capturing them, and how we can be able to integrate this into our world. So as I mentioned, I love black and white is really where I always kind of end up, and this whole long exposure world is pretty neat. And so we're going to go through and edit most of these photos later on, but before we even get to that, like I said, I want to talk about some of the techniques that I've learned over the last 3 or so years that I've been working on this long exposure work, and what I found, and some of the problems I've run into, and if you are not yet doing long exposure work, how you can get into it. So let's go. What you'll need. So to start off making some long exposure images, of course you're going to need a few things. So the first thing is a camera, and that's pretty obvious. We all have cameras of some sort, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the next thing is going to be a tripod. I really don't know, unless you're going to put it onto the car hood or if you've got a bean bag. Without a tripod, it's pretty darn difficult. A cable remote release, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that is pretty important. And also a neutral density filter or an ND filter, and that's only needed if you're going to shoot in the day. There's some stuff that I do at nighttime that doesn't require an ND filter, but if you're going to do stuff in the daytime, you're going to need an ND filter. And of course, there's one other very important thing: patience. Seriously, you're going to need a lot of patience. And you're going to need a good book. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's talk about each of those individual elements and what we need in there. So the first thing is a camera. So pretty much any camera is going to do. So the only thing you have to think about from the camera perspective is that noise will become an issue when you're shooting these extra long exposures. And that's because you're going to be shooting for a long period of time. We all have seen that noise increases under a couple of situations. One circumstance that noise may increase is when you've got your ISO ramped up. So the higher your ISO, the more noise that comes into your image, or the more noise that you see in your image. Another thing, though, that increases noise is really the length of time that the exposure is being created. And so one of the things that we really want to avoid is taking cameras who are having a natural tendency for that. So you can usually figure this stuff out. The good news is, though, of course, a lot of cameras have mechanisms inside of them to help reduce that. So for example, on my camera that I shoot with, there's an option in there for extra long exposure noise reduction. And so with the long exposure noise reduction option, what it'll actually do is it will capture an extra frame of the same length and uses that to identify what we call hot pixels, or these really, really bright individual red, green, or blue pixels that sometimes show up in the images. By shooting an extra frame, it'll naturally or almost magically subtract it. You may get, though, that you may find yourself not wanting to use that option because it will take another exposure of the same length, meaning if you just took an 8-minute exposure, it'll take another 8-minute exposure. So that means to take one picture, you've just spent 16 minutes. I'm a bit lazy, so I found that in some situations it's actually faster to retouch out the hot pixels than it is to wait for it, but it really depends on you. As I mentioned earlier, when you're shooting, you make sure that you use a tripod and a cable release. And then another thing that's really interesting or important to do is to make sure to cover the eye cup or the viewfinder. If you've got a camera that has a built-in eye viewfinder shutter, use that. And if you don't have one of those, then a piece of black electrical tape is something that you need. So the reason for this is because light will actually enter your camera through that viewfinder. So if you've got a really, really dark scene in front of you, or for example, if you're using a neutral density filter, which is blocking out a lot of the light, it may be so much brighter, the light coming through the viewfinder, than what is coming in through the lens, that you will do a couple of things. One, it will throw off your exposure meter, which makes taking exposure rendering really, really hard. And the other thing is that it could actually allow light to leak in and, in essence, fog your exposure. So, as I mentioned, either if you've got the little shutter on the viewfinder, flip that up. If you don't have that, then just jerry-rig something, making sure that no light, while you're taking the exposure, can get through that idea in there, through that viewfinder. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll just leave that shutter closed so I don't forget, because I have forgotten at points in the past, and then I'll just use like the live view function on my camera to be able to compose the image. And so if you have the live view mechanism on your camera, like a lot of us do, you can use that for setting it up. And even if you've got a really strong ND filter in front of there, it should still work. But the point here is really close that shutter. And the next thing is like how to meter your scene. So this is something that can be a little bit complicated because we're going to be doing a little bit of photo math. And I know if you're anything like me, the reason I got into photography is because I'm horrible at math. But there's a couple things that unfortunately we have to learn. Good news is you can usually print out a little handy dandy sheet from the internet to be able to give you that information. But the idea here is that when your ND filter is on your lens, you may not have enough light for your light meter to be able to meter the scene. So what you may have to do is you may have to meter the scene with the ND filter off of the lens. Figure out where it is and figure out, okay, well, this scene right now, it's going to be, let's say, 1/30th of a second at f/22. And usually I do use f/22 or the lowest, the smallest aperture, just because I want to make sure that I'm going to have as much time as possible. Now, of course, it depends on your goal. f/22 may not be as sharp as, let's say, f/11, but at f/22 at least it's letting the least amount of light into your image, and that way I can really take advantage of needing or allowing it to use more time. But let's say that you metered it at 1/30th of a second. What you can do is you can then take in consideration the filter factor of your ND filter. So let's say you're using a 10-stop ND filter. You can calculate the slower shutter speed. For example, here I have it written out. So if you start off at 1/30th of a second, 10 stops down, you go down 1/15th to an 1/8 to a 1/4, a half, a second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 16 seconds to 32 seconds. So you can see that if you start off at a 1/30th of a second exposure without a 10-stop ND filter, that scene will become a 32-second exposure with that 10-stop ND filter. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Now I noticed I did skip over one point that is important, which is up on the kind of the fourth paragraph up here, which is that I found, at least on my camera, and I do shoot Nikon, so it may be different on Canon, but I found on Nikon cameras at least, that when you're on the aperture priority or the shutter priority mode, a lot of times the light meter will read low, meaning that it thinks it's too low to provide you with a reading. For some reason though, if I switch to manual mode, in manual mode it will actually show me a light meter rating that I found to be pretty accurate. So if you are going out there and you are shooting, and if you're anything again like me, I usually leave it on the aperture priority mode most of the time, and you're finding that you're trying to meter the scene and it's a little bit dark outside and the meter does come up saying low, then I would recommend that you go in there and switch to manual mode, and you might be able to get a meter reading there. So anyway, let's go on to the next one. So a tripod. So as I mentioned before, really there's almost nothing more important when doing long exposure work than a trusty tripod. And I've had purchased a fair share of tripods and found that there's of course two important elements in there. And it's pretty obvious, but it's got to be said. It needs to have sturdy legs and a sturdy head. So from a legs perspective, I'm finding that carbon fiber sticks, I've seen a lot of people out there buying carbon fiber sticks or legs and getting really good options on them. There's a bunch of companies out there that are making really cost-effective and high-quality carbon fiber legs. There's the company Enduro. I've seen that's made some really good cost-effective that will, as I put in here, break neither your back nor your bank, which is pretty great. I've personally been using Gitzo for a while. I like the Gitzo sticks, but it's just a personal preference. I've been using them for a little while now, and recently stepped up to a very large one. I'm a pretty tall person. I'm 6'4", and for a while I was using a very short tripod, and my back was hurting quite a bit. So I got a tripod that I can stand up straight and look through the viewfinder without any problems, and been really happy about this. The one thing that I have found, because I do like to go out shooting landscape stuff, and if you've never bought or don't own carbon fiber sticks, just as a point of recommendation, make sure that you get some kind of a cushion on there, because I've never experienced cold like cold carbon fiber legs. I mean, it just saps out this warmth from your hands like nothing else. The other thing is about the head. You know, I've seen pretty much everybody I know is using a ball head most of the time these days. The ball heads, of course, are the ones that have only one option to tighten or loosen it, and just a little thing that you turn to be able to loosen it and turn it around to tighten it, and it allows you to have the full range of motion from the head. And they're pretty sturdy. And for those, I've been using the Really Right Stuff. I've got two Really Right Stuff heads. I've got the BH40 and the BH55. The 40 I use on my travel tripod because it's light. The 55 I use for the serious long exposure work because it is rock solid. And then there's another thing that you can do if you really want to get fancy, which is to add a stabilizing base. And what that does is it basically it takes you replace the center post. A lot of tripods have a center post, and that center post is the thing that allows the tripod head alone to go up a little bit higher, so you can set your stick height, and then you can use your center post to go up and down. Using a stabilizing base, what that allows you to do basically is you remove the post, you put that base on there, the base absorbs some vibrations, because vibrations, of course, are what would create a soft exposure in your images. And one of the cool things about long exposure work that we really want to focus on is having a nice juxtaposition of sharp details and soft details. And the only way to do that is to really have, again, sturdy. So if you really want to go out all over the place, you can get good sticks, a good head, and then a stabilizing base. I'm personally using the Markins TB30 stabilizing base, which helps, and I've seen a lot of reviews online, some people that did some really in-depth research on how much absorption of vibrations that it creates or it helps out with, and it's pretty great. So I've been really happy with that setup of the Gitzo Really Right Stuff and Markins base. But like I said, there's a lot of options out there, a lot of companies out there that make really great options. So do your research and figure out what makes sense for you from the cost and benefit perspective. The next thing is a release that you'll need. And I put a couple different options up here because they really, one to the next, doesn't make any technical difference. So on the left-hand side, we've got the cheapest. On the right-hand side, we have the most expensive. And of course, the features and functionality go up as it goes over there. Now, most cameras don't have a longer shutter speed than 30 seconds. And I found that a lot of times I'm doing things longer than 30 seconds. So the only way to do that is through a cable release. The only reasonable way to do that is through a cable release. So of course the very, very simple cable release that you've probably seen, even if you've never used one of these, you've definitely seen people using these things with their large format cameras, even if it was just in a movie. But this one, just you hold it down as long as you want the exposure. It doesn't have, or because of the cable, it removes or at least reduces greatly the vibration of actually pressing the shutter button. And of course, a lot of these things do have a mechanism inside of there that you can use to hold it down. And so you would just use that. You could lock it in place so you don't have to physically hold it, and then use a timer to figure out what's your exposure. And the good thing is when you're dealing with 180, 200 second exposure, half a second more or less isn't really a big deal. So you don't have to be incredibly precise, but it does give you that option. The next step are the ones in the middle here. What that is, those are two options. One's a Nikon, one's a Canon one. Just so you can see, they're basically the rough equivalents to each other. The Nikon one is called the MC36. The Canon one is called the TC80N3. And both of these allow you to do a bunch of stuff. But the reason I use them, or specifically the MC36 with my Nikons, is for being able to program in your exposure length. And what you can tell it is, I'm going to do a 2-minute exposure, and then you hit the start button, and then it automatically composes the image for 30 seconds and sets it up, and you're done. The other cool thing about both of those that you can do is they do have built-in intervalometers, which means that they will allow you to set certain preset lengths of time for a certain number of images with a certain delay between them. Now, usually intervalometers are used for stop-motion photography, but what I found them really useful for is set up a series. I'll have an image series that I really like, and I want to be able to capture that. And I want to be able to take a bunch of pictures because I don't really know exactly when are the clouds going to be perfectly from the starting point to the ending point. I don't know when the people walking around there are going to be out of the frame. And it's sometimes really hard, especially when you're talking about 4-minute or 8-minute exposures, to anticipate how the end result's going to look. So I found that I can set up a good looking scene, and I know the lighting is going to roughly stay the same for the next hour or so. I can set up maybe 8 4-minute exposures all shot in a row, set it up, and then I'll go sit on the bench with my book and read the book, which is where that book came in from before. And then the last one on the right-hand side is the promote control. I also have a promote control. I use it a lot, especially for HDR work. But what I found also is that it's a really, really easy to program, quick and powerful tool for doing the similar things that the MC36 or the TC80N3 can do. But it can do a little bit more. As it relates to the long exposure work, it's just a little bit easier to program, and it has more controls or more options as it relates to how many exposures you're going to do and in what sense you're going to set those up. So I found myself sometimes using that one. Now, in terms of a cost perspective, the cable release, you might be able to get one for $5. The ones in the middle, the MC36 or the TC80N3, they're both about $130, and the promote control is about $300. So it really depends on what you need. For the most part, for the long exposure work, the stuff in the middle, like the MC36, is great, and I think it's really awesome. But I do like the promote control a lot as well. It really, your mileage may vary. And then the last thing that we talked about that you'll need is an ND filter. Now, with the ND filters, as I mentioned earlier, the only reason you need an ND filter is really if you're going to be shooting in the daytime. At nighttime, you can oftentimes get pretty long exposures without really needing to use an ND filter. But a lot of times I found that I really like the long exposures in the daytime. I find that I can even shoot in the horrible time of the day, meaning that right around noon, and still get really cool looking shots because there still is going to be an interplay oftentimes between the light from the sun and the clouds, and there's going to be some diffusion happening because of the clouds interplaying with the sun, especially if you're in a cloudy environment. And so I found that I do often, or more often than not, shoot during the day. And in order to do that, then I need an ND filter. Now, some brief things about the ND filters. Of course, a neutral density filter, as it says here, blocks out light without introducing a color cast. So that's the whole goal of an ND filter. Now, when we're doing stuff in black and white, the color cast isn't that big of a deal. But in case that it is important to you, or you want to do some long exposure color work, which sometimes I do, it's really nice to have it being really neutral. Of course, ND filters are offered in different strengths. They range from 1 stop to 10 stops and all these different stops in between. If you're going to be doing anything like up to 3 or 4 stops, there's a lot of companies out there that offer options. As soon as you go above that, though, it really narrows it down, and I've only found, at least so far, that there are 2 companies out there that are offering 10-stop filters. And if you think about that, the 10-stop filter is blocking out a whole lot of light. I forgot how many million times light reduction it does, but you can think about it's reducing the light by half, by half, by half, by half, by half, by half, times 10, until you get to that point of light blockage. And that's what allows you to have that option to take a picture that's a couple minutes in the middle of the sunlight. And there's 2 options really there. One is B plus W, and the other one's Lee. The B plus W ND110 filter is the one that I started off with, and I still use it. It's a really great filter. It's a screw-on filter, and the maximum size that they have for that is a 77 millimeter thread mount. So if you've got a 77 millimeter thread mount, you can use that. It's a great looking filter, and it works really well. But one of the things I have found, though, is that oftentimes I need more than 10 stops. There's a couple of pictures which we'll show you in a bit that I did, I needed 16 total stops of light stoppage, and that meant with the Lee I had to do filter stacking. The B plus W, I had to put one filter on top of the next filter on top of the next filter, and that meant that I ultimately had a lot of filters stacked on top of each other, and because it's a circular filter, we started getting the vignetting around the edges, which is why I started using recently the Lee system, the Big Stopper, which is a 4-inch by 4-inch or 100 millimeter by 100 millimeter option that the filters drop into that. And you can see on the right, that's the Lee Big Stopper inside of its holder. And that can go onto a wide range of different lenses. You just buy a really inexpensive filter adapter that screws onto the front of your lens, and then this holder can snap off and then pop onto different lenses really easily, which is quite nice. You don't have to rebuy or repurchase for different lenses if you have different lenses with different filter mounts and sizes. And of course, the cool thing about the Lee one is that you can stack multiple filters on top of it. I've got the one, you can do 3 on top of it. So I've got a 10 stop and a couple 3 stops and a 6 stop. So depending on what it is that I want to do, I can blend these together using the different filters, and you can even put in the front of it like a graduated neutral density if you want to just bring down the top or the foreground, however you want to do it. So it's a pretty cool system. Both of them are really good, and I still use both of them, and there's pros and cons on both sides of it. So yeah, that's enough text and talking. Let's go ahead and edit some pictures. So here we are inside of Lightroom. I'm working in Lightroom 4. We've got a couple of images inside of here, and we'll talk about some of these, each one individually, and then we'll edit them. Just as a word of note, basically working inside of Lightroom or working in Photoshop, either one of those, the functionality inside of our software, inside of the Nik software plugins, is going to be the same. It's going to look the same, it's going to work the same, and it's going to operate the same. So it really doesn't matter which one you're working in. Of course, Photoshop does allow you to do layers and smart objects, etc. And there's a lot of things that I do in there. In fact, for the vast majority of my image editing, I will open it inside of Photoshop simply because of that smart object functionality, which allows me to undo any of the changes I've made and really make it a completely non-destructive editing experience. For the purpose of this presentation, though, I'm going to be working inside of Lightroom because, again, the operations inside of SilverFX Pro 2 are going to be exactly the same. So, that being said, a couple of things to consider. As we talked about before, noise can oftentimes become an issue if you're going to be using long exposure work. So, you may need to go into Define to do that, to do the noise reduction. One of the things I found, I've been lucky enough, I've been shooting a lot of stuff with either a D700 or a D3, and both of those have very low noise characteristics, and I found that on the images that I've been shooting, noise has not become an issue as I go through those and be able to edit them. So for right now, especially because of the amount of time that we have, I'm going to be focusing predominantly on just SilverFX Pro 2. But of course, we have noise reduction tools if you need them. Oops, sorry about that. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to right click, I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to select Edit in SilverFX Pro 2. Now, when we're inside of Lightroom, it's going to, of course, ask me a couple questions as I go through this, just to make sure that we're working on everything appropriately. The TIFF file format is great. The color space, actually I would use ProPhoto for these settings. It doesn't really matter as much in black and white as it does in color, but still has some benefit to working in ProPhoto, especially since we're using large gamut printers like these Epson large format printers that we can use. And then, of course, the other thing that's really important is the bit depth of 16 bits. The resolution isn't really that important, actually. We can change that at any point. It doesn't really change anything. But right now, the most important things are TIFF, ProPhoto, and 16 bits per channel or per component. Once we make sure that those are all set up, we click Edit In. It's going to ask Lightroom to create a new TIFF file and then open that TIFF file directly up inside of Silverflex Pro 2. So for those of you that are not so familiar with Silverflex Pro 2, I'll give a real quick overview, and then from this point forward we'll just edit. On the left-hand side you can see our presets. So these presets here basically enable us to go through and edit our images with one click. So if we like something, we just click on it, and it's going to change all of the slider settings on the right-hand side accordingly to that. For this presentation, though, I'm just going to go ahead and close that preset section just so that we can focus predominantly on the image and the sliders on the right-hand side. Now, the sliders on the right-hand side really are where we're going to get all of our control and the capability of editing the image. We've got a bunch of different sections over here. The top are our global adjustments, which are our basic kinds of enhancements. And then as we go down, we've got some other controls like our color filter, film types, and our finishing adjustments. Now, for some of the filters, or some of the images I should say, we will use a lot of these different controls. But this image right here is a pretty simple, straightforward image to edit, and we'll just start off with it. Now, this image was shot at nighttime. It was a 30-second exposure. You may have seen that inside of Lightroom before I opened it up. This is in Tokyo, and I had just had some meetings with our friends at Nikon Corporation talking about Capture Next stuff at one point a couple years ago. And I was going to the hotel, and on the way back from the hotel, went to dinner, and actually the restaurant was on the left, in that building on the left-hand side, and I laid down on the floor, on the ground, and set my tripod up and shot an image up here, and 10 seconds later, a Japanese security guard came yelling at me, telling me I'm not allowed to take pictures there. But luckily I caught the shot, not selling it, so hopefully it's okay to just use it for educational purposes only. But the cool thing I like about this one is, again, that interaction between the clouds moving and the hard stopped buildings. So with this, though, I look at this image and I try and ask myself, what is it that I want to do with this image? How do I want to make this image look better? So the first thing I want to say is let's go ahead and increase the contrast. It's really flat. The blacks aren't black enough and the whites aren't white enough. I want to increase the richness of the image. That first step of increasing the richness, we can do that a couple of different ways. A lot of times what I find myself doing when I start thinking about contrast is I start using these amplify blacks and amplify white sliders on the right hand side under contrast. So if, by the way, you don't have that open, sometimes you may see the interface looking like this. Just click on these little triangles here to expand it out, and that way you'll get access to those individual controls underneath there. Now, the Amplify Blacks and Amplify Whites are two of the really, really cool and unique algorithms that we have only inside of Silverflex Pro 2, and what they do is they go throughout the image and try and figure out how does it amplify or enhance or increase the blacks in each area or object, or the whites in each area and object. So what you'll see is as I drag this slider over to the right, the image doesn't actually get darker. So if you think about like a black point compensation, the black point would actually make the whole image darker. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm actually asking the software to increase the blacks in every area of the image. If I do the same now with the Amplify Whites, you'll notice that I can increase these different elements, and you'll see that the whites start to come out in the lights of the building and some of the areas here. So let's just see what we've done so far with just the Amplify Blacks and Whites. This is before and after, and then before and after. You can see now there's more richness in the clouds, there's more richness in the buildings. It needs to have some more to it, though. And so one of the things I do start off with, as I mentioned, is the contrast, because I find that the contrast between the Amplify whites and blacks and the contrast itself can help me really refine the look and feel of the image. Then, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll start utilizing the brightness controls. So, and oftentimes I will use the individual brightness controls, meaning the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows, so that I can go through and bring out or up each one of these different elements. So as I look at this image, I kind of like that richness of the area, like basically where the clouds weren't. So we're seeing the night sky peeking through the clouds. So I can bring that down a little bit. I can then use the highlights to adjust the brightness of some areas, like the windows or the lights in these buildings. Now, mind you, it is Japan, so of course, even though it's midnight, there's lots of people working, unfortunately. And then the last thing is the midtones. And a lot of times what I'll do is I will adjust the midtones as the last step, because to me the midtones are one of the most important elements of any black and white image. I really focus in on the midtones whenever I'm doing a black and white conversion to make sure that the result has this richness and this kind of really fine or finely retuned midtone elements. And it was actually one of those control elements that we really spent a lot of time on with Silver Efex Pro 2, ensuring that the midtones looked good. Because whenever you go out and you see a film-based black and white, I've always felt that the midtones look just spectacular. But whenever we saw some of the previous kinds of approaches to black and white, the midtones were a little bit lacking. So we can just fine-tune these elements. One of the cool things about Silver Efex Pro, of course, is that after you've made an adjustment, you can go back in there and refine it some more. So if you find that you've overdone it in one side or another, you can very easily go back and then fine-tune it afterwards. So this is a pretty straightforward and simple image for me from an editing perspective. That's why I wanted to start off with it, because we wanted to just start off with something simple and fast. I don't actually take it very much farther than here. So this is before and this is after, and I found that this prints really, really well. I have this printed out pretty large. I did I think a 24 by 30 of this, and the detail is really great, and the tonality is really great. So I think it's really, really fun to be able to take these images where you don't have to spend that much time editing them. And that's what's really fun, is to be able to take an image, have a concept, walking around at night, take a picture, come back to the hotel or your house, edit it, print it out, and you're done within 10 minutes, and that's really, really fun that you can do that. So again, before and after. But let me cancel out of that one, and then we can start talking about some other images and what we do with them. So here's another image. This one is at 180-second exposure. So that's a 3-minute exposure, basically. And this was shot in the middle of the day. This is actually in Lithuania. I was traveling there, and this is on a little peninsula called the Curonian Spit. So this is the Baltic Sea right there, and it's about August, so it's pretty warm there. The ocean water, or the Baltic Sea, was a nice temperature. It was really almost the same as the Pacific Ocean, about 20 degrees Celsius, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Not many waves, but one of the things that I saw was that the clouds were moving at the same plane as the horizon. And that's something that I really liked a lot. So I wanted to do a long exposure work, so I was kind of up on a hill looking down, and I saw this horizon line, and by taking these long exposure, I'm able to create that softness of the clouds moving at the same angle, the same plane of the horizon line, and then by using that long exposure, we can make that horizon line incredibly sharp, which is really cool to have that. And then of course there's people moving, some people staying still, some people sunbathing, some people with their umbrellas, and it kind of adds to that feeling of the image. So I'm going to go in here again, and I'm going to select Edit in, Silver Efex Pro 2. Everything's set up the same from the last time, so I'm going to click Edit. And it's going to open up a new TIFF file for me, and then open that inside of Silver Efex Pro 2. Now, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to close out my presets. And on this one, we're going to start off with some of the more advanced tools inside of here. Now, the first thing that I want to do with this image is, as we talked about, I really like the clouds. And so I didn't have a polarization filter on my camera at the time of shooting this, so there isn't that much separation. But luckily, the sky was nice blue, and the clouds were nice white. So I can utilize some of the tools that we have on the right-hand side under the film types to be able to accentuate that. So I'm going to start off by taking the blue slider and dragging that down all the way to -100, and then the cyan slider and dragging it down all the way to -100 as well. So this is a starting point. You can see that the sky is starting to get a little bit darker. We're adding more depth and dimensionality to the sky and bringing those clouds out. And the other thing that we're doing is we're helping to create this dark on top, light on bottom, so that we have this natural movement that goes from the top to bottom, or bottom to top, however your eye flows. But it gives a little bit more energy to the image. So after I started off with that one, and I often do, by the way, start off with the film type sensitivity when I'm doing this kind of work, the next thing I'm going to do is go into color filter. Because we can use the color filter, much like we were using the color filters in the analog days, to be able to create different kinds of color separations. So just like we would have used a red filter in the panchromatic black and white film days to be able to darken skies and bring clouds out, again, I can do the same here by taking the strength slider and dragging it up, because we already have the red hue selected. Now, of course, I could click on the red hue, the red filter here, but a lot of times what I find is I want to actually dial it in precisely to what it is that I want to create. And so as I do that, I can start to see that I'm getting that look that I want to have, that the blacks are starting to come out of the sky, it's starting to darken the sky, the clouds are getting nice separation. One of the things you may notice, though, if I drag that down again, if you see in the foreground is starting to lighten up. And the reason for that is because the foreground has some yellows and some reds in it. So this filter is going to brighten any of the reds or yellows and darken any of the blues or cyans. So what I can do then is I can kind of compensate for that by taking this yellow slider on under the film type sensitivity, and maybe also the red slider a little bit as well. Because I really want to focus in on using these two tools, the color filter and the sensitivity, to really darken the sky. So now that I've started off there, I've got a good starting point. The next thing that I want to do is I'm going to take this amplify black slider, and I'm going to start increasing that. Now the reason I didn't start off with this is because in this image especially, or in many images, sometimes the amplify blacks can start to take the clouds, especially the lighter clouds, and start to darken them too much. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to use the colors in the image to help separate the different subjects and tones first, and then use the amplify blacks on top of that to be able to fine-tune it a little bit more. So if we go in there and we can see what happens if we drag it all the way to the right, or if we bring it back a little bit. One of the things that I've always loved, there was a saying that Vincent Versace had taught me a while ago, which was, do a heroic advance and then a strategic retreat, meaning go all the way to the right. And I do this all the time. Go all the way, and then slowly bring it back until you get something that you're balancing between, in this case, the dark sky and the light clouds. So now that I've got that here, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to drag over this amplify whites, because what the amplify whites is going to do now is it's going to bring out some of the lightness of the clouds. And so I'm starting to get the look that I want. I'm bringing it up step by step, and now I can start looking at this image, now that I've done the global adjustments, and start asking myself, all right, well, is there anything that I want to do just from a specific or localized perspective? And that's where we're going to use our control points. So as you've probably seen from some of our other products, our control points are really one of those core and really useful and powerful tools that differentiates the software from many other pieces of applications out there. What I found is that with using these control points, we can really draw attention and focus to certain areas of the image, and also help resolve other areas or other problems that we might have. Now, looking at this image, one of the things that I see pretty naturally is a couple things. One, I kind of don't like that this is a lot brighter in this area here than other areas. The second thing is that underneath, it's a little bit too dark over here. So I'm going to brighten that area up. The next thing I'm going to do is probably darken this part of the ocean down a little bit so I have a more uniform ocean. And then finally, I'm going to make the sand in the foreground a little bit more uniform. Because what I want to do for sure here is I want to have this next level of kind of compositionality that we have here, which is we've got this band of light, what I want to be pretty uniform. We've got a band of dark, which is the sea, and then we've got another band of light, which is going to be the area right above the sea, beneath the clouds, and then we have this interesting cloud area in there. And I'm going to use control points to do that. Now, to start off with, we can go over here, we can click on the Add Control Point, and it really doesn't matter which order you do this in. It really doesn't. Usually the way that I do it is whatever distracts me the most. So I'm going to start off on this left side over here and add a control point, and then I'm going to start brightening that area up just a little bit. Trying to get that area, and I'm not going to try and make it exactly the same tonality, but I'm going to make it a little bit more in line with the rest of it. So as I did that, what you may have noticed though is that the sea got a little bit brighter also. So I brightened up the sky, and then the sea area over here got a little bit brighter as well. That's because there's a similarity between the sky and the sea. Now if I add another control point, I can do is I can help to differentiate those two objects. You may have noticed as soon as I dropped that control point of the sea, it jumped down in brightness, it became less bright. That's because now the software knows that there's a difference between the sky area and the sea area. And the way that that works is the control point is going to look at the underlying pixels. And one of the things that we can look at, and I may have glossed over before, is that we are actually looking at a color image. We're working on a color image. Silverfix Pro always maintains that color data at all times. So we can see by looking at this color image that the sea is green and the sky is cyan. So, and that's fine, that's good because we have that separation of color and that helps us out. And the control points will use that separation of color. In fact, this control point right now on the sea understands that the sea is a certain red, green, and blue value. It has a certain hue, saturation, and brightness value. It has a certain texture, meaning that it's soft, not like the sand, which has a little bit of texture to it. So it knows all those elements, and it uses that to be able to differentiate from the other control point that's currently on the sky. So let's close that out there. So now what I can do is, as I mentioned earlier, I want to darken that area up a little bit because I want to have that nice, uniform, dark sea. The next thing that I want to do is, maybe I can go back in here actually now and brighten it up just a little bit more now that I do have that separation, and it helps me differentiate those different objects. And now you can see by these two control points, which I'll show you by turning off over here. You can see this is before the control points, and then after the control points, we've got a much better, finer separation of the sky and the sea. So I think that's a really helpful tool because we can really accentuate that horizon line, which is, I believe, a very strong element of the composition of this image. The next thing I see that I want to revise is actually this hot spot on the sand right here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to drag that down a little bit because what I want to have, again, is a nice uniform sand on the bottom, but I don't want it to be too dark. So I'm going to just bring it down just a tad. And then I'm going to add another control point on the right or the left side, and I'm going to brighten that up just a tad so that I do have a nice uniform element between the left and the right. And then again, another one over here, and I'm just visually adjusting these elements until I have some of that uniformity that I want to have on that sandy strip on the bottom there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a control point here in the middle, and I'm going to darken this area down just a little bit. Make that a little bit brighter, or I'm sorry, not brighter, but a little bit bigger. And then maybe drag it up just a tad. So now I've got that nice darkness at the top, so it's almost like we got a thin band of light right above the sea, and then it transitions quickly to a darker area. The next thing I'll probably do is add a control point into the clouds, but at this point, if I start brightening or adjusting these things, I'm not really sure what's actually going to happen from a tonality perspective. I don't want to have to print this out and then look at it and see, oh gee, I made it too bright. So this is where one of these tools that we have inside of Silverfx Pro 2 comes into play, which is inside of the loop histogram. It's this little guy on the bottom right here, which is our zone strip. And basically what we did is we separated the image into 11 different zones. And what each one of those zones does is I roll over it, is it shows me where those areas are in the image. So right now, when I roll over zone 8, you can see that the highlights of the clouds are right now zone 8. If we go down here to zone 0, you'll see that we've got some of the sky in zone 0 and a lot of the sky in zone 1 and probably also in zone 2. So what each one of these zones means, basically. So a zone 0 typically is shadow without detail, meaning that if I print this out, I'm not really going to see any detail in those areas, and that's fine. There is no detail in the sky. In fact, I don't want to see detail because at this point, any kind of detail you may see would be noise because that sky should be smooth and uniform. So I'm not really having a problem with that being pure black. Zone 10 on the other side would be pure white, highlights without detail. A lot of times what we don't want to have, especially if we're printing out on any kind of paper that has any kind of a gloss to it, we don't want to print anything other than specular highlights at zone 10. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not some of the tips of clouds should be a specular highlight or not. Most of the time I only want specular highlights when there's chrome or glass, like to show that really strong reflection. So for me, what I want is I want these clouds to be zone 9. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to go over here to zone 9 and I'm going to see right now nothing is showing up in zone 9. So I'm actually going to click on the zone 9. It's going to lock it in place. And now I can go back up here again and I can take that brightness slider, and if I keep on brightening it, what you'll notice is now as I keep on brightening it, now the cloud points are in zone 9. And if I want to just make sure that I don't have any zone 10, sometimes what I'll do is I'll go over here, turn off zone 9, roll over zone 10, make sure that I have no zone 10s in there. But more often than not, I'll do that towards the end of the editing. So at this point, I want that same kind of the brightest part of the cloud, which in this case is going to be the middle part of the cloud. And you can think about that logically. The reason why the middle part of the cloud is going to be the brightest part of the cloud in a long exposure is because that's the area of the cloud that had the sunlight hitting it for the longest. So of course, towards the right, the cloud had been moving in that direction and got only a little bit of the sun, so as you can see it starts fading to darker. Same thing to the left, but in the center part of the cloud, where the cloud was for the most part staying in the area and there was light reflecting off of that part of the world back into the sensor, that should really be the brightest part. Makes perfect sense. And I want to keep that there. I'm going to now take this control point and I'm going to copy it. Now, there's a couple ways you can do this. You can either use your Control C or Command C shortcut on your keyboard. You can hold the command button, or I'm sorry, the command button, the option or the alt button as you're dragging it, or you can even go over here to the control point section and you can click on this duplicate button, or even you can do Control D or Command D. A lot of different ways you can do this. I found that the option or alt dragging is the fastest way of doing this. So what I can do here is option drag to different parts of the clouds that I want to have that effect going in. And then I can take a look at what we're doing with the image, and maybe even on some of these bring it down just a little bit. We don't need so much brightness areas in there. But yeah, so that looks a little bit better. I can go in here, I can turn off this element in the zone map. And if you want to, another thing you can do is you can drag around all these options in here, select the different ones, and then you can group them together. So for example, hitting this group button over here will take all of those, and so now making one slider adjustment is adjusting them all simultaneously. And that helps out quite a bit. The other thing I like to do a lot of times is add a little bit of structure to clouds, because what that's going to do is it's going to help us increase the texture or detail or kind of feeling of the clouds by almost adding a little bit of a sharpening effect to just bringing up some of that effect in there. So now that we've got that, let's take a look at the before and after. So I'm just going to go back into our history browser. If I click on the compare button, right now it's going to compare it to the color image, because what I did earlier was I wanted to show you that this was a color image. If I drag this yellow slider over here down to preset 000 neutral, what it's going to show you is a before and after between where we started off with when we first opened SilverFX Pro 2 up and where we ended up with after we've edited it. So a big difference from before to after, and it accomplishes that goal that we set out for, which was to maintain, different stripes of the sand to sea to area under the clouds to the cloud area, made the clouds dark, the sky dark and the clouds bright, and increased that dimensionality between them. And it really helped us create that look that we wanted to have. And then by utilizing our zone map, it gives us the opportunity for being able to create that really good looking image in the end when we printed it out, so we know where the details and tonality is going to fall. Looks like I'm running low on time, so let me just go in here and let's edit one more picture real quickly, just to give you an idea of the different things you can do. Let's see here. Maybe we do this one, just because I threw this one in here, just because I wanted to show you that just because it looks really horrible when you first open it up doesn't mean it's going to be really horrible. One of the things that I did here, this was when I was in Uruguay, and I was just out on the rocks in on the sea, and wanted to take some long exposure work. The sun had just set. I was literally standing, with 2 feet spread apart, trying to balance my tripod and making sure that I wouldn't fall as I was capturing this image. And I didn't have the opportunity to grab my remote trigger at this point, because originally I was actually shooting in the middle of the day and I wasn't doing long exposure work. But I saw this one shot that I wanted to capture, and the result though was that I could only capture 30 seconds worth, and it turned out to be too dark. So because of all these various different things, I just couldn't capture it. But I decided to try editing it anyway, and I found that it turned out to be a pretty good image after all. So it's important to think that just because you didn't get all the right detail, or it wasn't bright enough, doesn't mean you can't get a good looking shot in the end. So that's all I want to say. And we'll take this image. You see it as you open it up, it's already not great, really muddy and dark. So we can go in here and we can start using the tools that we have to bring out the look and the feel that we want to have in our images. So in this case, what we can do, of course, is we can start brightening it up, adding some contrast in there, using the Amplify Whites tool and structure. And then we can start bringing up some of the blacks as well. And then we can start playing around with some of these other tools, like the ability to darken the shadows, adjust the midtones in there, adjust the highlights. And so this just goes to show that there's a lot of opportunity with images that even if they look far from optimal, we can go in there really quickly using some of these tools to be able to take that look that we want to have, that juxtaposition between the lines in the rock and the tonality and the directionality of the leading lines, bringing us into the center part of the image, the smoothness of the waves as they're washing over the rocks. We have all of these options, and it's really quite cool. Then we can use our control points. Maybe I want to improve the look and the tonality of the sky. We have a little bit of a haloing issue, or not vignetting issue here. I can then add this control point up here. Now we've got a nice, solid, smooth-looking sky. I may even make these into a group by using Command G for a shortcut. Take the structure out of the sky because we want the sky to be nice and smooth. Adding another control point right here to the rocks because I want the eye to go right to this area. Here, add some structure in there, add a little bit of contrast, a little bit of adjust the brightness a little bit. Adding another control point down here to the foreground, maybe brighten it up just a tad. We don't want it to be too heavy and too dark down here. And then a little bit of structure as well and some contrast. And you can see, like, with just pretty quickly, you can go from here to here. So taking one of those images that just isn't that great to start off with, but you can do something really awesome with it. So unfortunately, I am out of time at this point. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to at least let you guys know that we do have a special discount code available, which is the EDU3 is the code. So if you go to our web shop, go to our shopping cart, add any product in there. If you do use the EDU3, it is going to save you some money. So for example, here I've got the complete collection, and of course a shameless plug, the Nick Software Captured book that we have, which Tony Corbell and I wrote, which will help you learn more about the Nick Software products and help you get it even better. But what you can do here is when you want to check out, put EDU3 into the shopping cart, click apply. You'll see that it didn't work. I don't know why it didn't work. I can do that again, but it'll be 15% off all of our Nick Software products. That's all of the software products. So for example, if I go back in here again, we'll just show you how that works. Click over here, buy a product like the complete collection, choose whichever one, the Ultimate Edition if you want to work in Photoshop, Lightroom and Aperture if you want to work only in Lightroom or Aperture. Macintosh, download, add to cart, EDU3, already applied. You see I'm saving $44.99, and then I can check out and we're done.